Hey art nerds, so we are on day 8 of the 7-inch Kara Kickstarter. If you're like completely new to this, you can check it out at 7inchkara.com/Kickstarter. And today I wanted to talk to you guys about the influences that 7-inch Kara have had on my other work, specifically on the blog and on this YouTube channel. So on the blog I've talked in depth about other works' influences on 7-inch Kara, but Kara has had such a big influence on the work I do here and the work I do on the blog, and even some of the things I share on Twitter, that I wanted to kind of talk to you guys about that. So I am going to walk Bo around the yard. I'm in Southeast Louisiana, where I originally grew up and where 7-inch Kara is set, so that's been a huge inspiration on 7-inch Kara. But I wanted to do a bit of a garden tour while I talked about the influence that 7-inch Kara has had on my other work. So as I walk, I thought Bowie, my adorable cat, might want to go for a walk as well. And if you guys like Pancake, but you've always thought, you know, he doesn't really behave the way a real cat would around a tiny person, he's based entirely, well, not almost, his personality is entirely based on Bo, and his physical appearances are based entirely off my first cat, who is a black Oriental cat. So now you know. But Bo is a really good-natured cat. He likes everybody. His one claim to fame is he once caught a 6-inch skink, played with it very gently for a little while, and then let it go. So if Bo were left alone in the wild, he would totally die. He is 100% an inside cat, except when he's on his leash wearing his cute little gray goyle wings. So before I get too deep into this, I want to give you guys a little bit of background on 7-inch Kara. So 7-inch Kara I first started 7-inch Kara in 2012, and it was part of my master's thesis at SCAD. So I'm a sequential art master's. It was part of my master's degree at SCAD, and my thesis was about how comics can support childhood literacy and what comic artists can do to make their comics more approachable to younger readers. And this was inspired by my own teaching work, because I was student teaching at a couple schools at the time, and I had student taught in the past. It was also inspired by my mom's work as a childhood literacy teacher, so I was able to field test a lot of those ideas, as well as do a lot of research. And at the time, middle grade comics was kind of a non-existent thing. This is right when Smile was first published, and nobody really understood how big a market that was. So when I started 7-inch Kara, there were a lot of people who dared to tell me, a woman who loved comics, that, you know, girls don't read comics, or don't bother making comics for girls, they won't read them, there's no market there, or even that young readers weren't interested in comics. And this was also a period of time where a lot of parents, teachers, and librarians thought that comics were actually detrimental to reading, which a lot of research since has proven the exact opposite, that comics are phenomenal for reading. They support so many things, and they can even be useful for teaching children with learning disabilities and emotional disabilities how to understand cause and effect, sequential storytelling, and also to understand emotions and how those are expressed by the human face and through body language. So, you know, I know it's funny coming from me, but I really think comics are just the best art form, and I wish more people could appreciate them, not only as a form of art, but as a form of literature. And you can see Bo thinks he's a little goat. So when I started 7-inch Kara, there wasn't like a set format for what a kidlit comic or a middle grade comic, and middle grade just means readers who are fairly competent, so they're like 4th grade to maybe 8th grade, middle grade readers. There wasn't really a set template for what those comics look like, because the only comic that was like that was Raina's Smile, and it had only come out maybe the year before. It was still pretty recent. And I remember she came to SCAD to give a talk and to also look at portfolios, and I was super excited because at the time SCAD had nothing to support children's comics, and I was all about children's comics. Oh, ate too much grass. Let's not watch the cat vomit. So that was really influential for me and very inspiring for me. So that's just a little bit of backstory on Kara. The first volume was published in 2014. I self-published it using CreateSpace, and I've talked about my experiences working with CreateSpace in the past. And the second comic is our second volume is hopefully going to be printed up this year, and that's what the Kickstarter is for. So if you enjoy the work I do here on this channel, if I have helped you, if you have been inspired by any of the work I do, from my life with ADHD to the watercolor reviews that I do, or even the intro to comic craft stuff, your support on Kickstarter is huge. If you guys... So when I first started 7-inch Kara, I was almost finished at SCAD, so I knew a lot about comics. I'd been a comic fan for years, and while I really loved watercolor, I was a big fan of Beatrix Potter and a big fan of traditionally illustrated children's picture books. I didn't really know a lot about watercolor because there hadn't been a lot of support for that interest in the past. I actually went to the University of New Orleans because they were going to start an illustration department, but Hurricane Katrina put the kibosh on that, so my degree from there is actually in digital media. And when I went to SCAD, I did have a couple of teachers who did their comics in watercolor, but there wasn't a lot of cross-departmental classes available to grad students. They kind of discouraged that, even though they said they didn't. And the transportation from Norris Hall to literally any of the other buildings was spotty at best, with the SCAD buses being notoriously late. So it was pretty prohibitive to take illustration classes, as much as I would have liked to do that, and as much as I think it would have made me a stronger artist. So a lot of what I learned about watercolor was through a lot of trial and error, spending a lot of money to buy art supplies that maybe weren't such a good fit for me, and a lot of school of internet. And there wasn't as much in 2012 as there is now. YouTube hadn't really taken off quite the way it is now. We have so much information, but there were still a few good resources like Wet Canvas. I was also very fortunate in that I had a friend who loved watercolor and did a lot of watercolor stuff that was willing to show me kind of the basics. But I still spent a lot of time learning how to paint and kind of figuring things out as I went along, which is why the first chapter of 7-inch Kara looks very different and looks a lot worse than subsequent chapters. I mean, I was still very new to watercolor, but I was also painting on student grade cellulose watercolor paper. I was using Canton's cheapest paper because I didn't know better, and I was painting with student grade watercolors and really struggling to use them. And this struggle really inspired me to share what I had learned about watercolor in a way that was accessible for anyone with an internet connection. I didn't want people to have to pay for that information. So this is post Becca, and so I was outside recording this, and it's going to come up a little bit later on, but the heat was really messing with my phone. It's like 90-something degrees outside, so the audio keeps cutting out. So I lost a lot of content here, and I'm just going to try and make up for lost time. So I learned a lot by trial and error, making a lot of mistakes, and honestly wasting a lot of money. But I wanted to share what I was learning with other people. I wanted to make this beautiful art form more accessible to more people. And I thought if they could just like get in and buy exactly what they need from the get-go, it might make it more accessible. So that's why I share so many of the reviews that I share, is I know that for someone who's new to this, or maybe they've tried it in the past and they really didn't like it and they're really struggling with it, those reviews, if they watch them and then they watch the field tests, could help them save some money and buy exactly what they're looking for. So watercolor for comics is pretty different from like fine art watercolor. You may use more layers, or you may decide to only do atmospheric color, or you may decide you want to utilize inked line art in addition. It's pretty different, like I said. So I thought sharing these experiences would be helpful to a lot of people and would make it more accessible. So right about at this point, I think it was a rabbit or a squirrel comes running out of the flower. No, not quite. Later. So in the beginning, when I was working on 7-inch Kara, I'd say the first 4 chapters, I was sharing some of the process on the blog, but it wasn't in a formal way. It was mostly like, this is the chapter I'm working on, this is the thumbnails, this is the roughs, this is the finished pages. But once I started the chapters that were going to go in volume 2, I decided I wanted to start kind of a collated series that started from the beginning and taught people how to go all the way from the concept of their comic to a finished watercolor page. So chapters 5 through I guess Naomi's bonus chapter, which is the last chapter in volume 2, really inspired my Watercolor Basics series and my Intro to Comic Craft series. And if you're only a YouTube viewer, if you don't read my blog, but you're interested in learning more about watercolor comics, I have a lot of really great information about painting watercolor comics, finding inspiration, what materials I recommend, and even some of the techniques that I don't necessarily get to cover in video format. I have that over on the blog, so I highly recommend you check it out. If you're a process person, that's definitely something you'll enjoy. And I have a hub page where I have almost all of the content for that collated in one place. So I'll make sure I link that for you guys. And this also inspired, so I started the Watercolor Basics first, and then I started Intro to Comic Craft because I just met so many people who really wanted to start making their own comics, but they were so caught up in their own heads and they were overthinking everything that it was hard for them to get started. So I created that to share my process. Everybody has a different process, but sometimes knowing how other artists work can be really helpful and can be inspiring. So I launched that to share my process, and it also gave me the opportunity to offer guest posts, paid guest posts. So I paid $30 a guest post to other comic artists so that they could talk about their own comic processes. So what I'd really wanted from that was to get lots of different comic artists sharing how they make comics. So anyone who was maybe timid about starting their comics journey could find an artist who they admired and kind of take inspiration from them. And it didn't quite pan out the way I wanted it to. It can be kind of difficult to get comic artists to write prose blog posts, but I was still able to get some artist interviews and tutorials over on the blog, and to share a variety of viewpoints. Particularly of interest to me were people who did webcomics who were designing their comic that week, which is very different from how I work, where I work in batch and everything has been planned out for months. So I wanted to show that viewpoint as well, because for many creators, that's kind of the way they start making comics. And I thought sharing those viewpoints would make it a lot more accessible. And over the years, I was able to use the blog not only to give other artists a platform to talk about their work, but to also promote other artists' Kickstarter projects and to hopefully help them find more funding and to help them find more fans. So if I hadn't been using the blog for 7-inch Kara at the time, if I hadn't been doing art supply reviews, if I hadn't been reviewing like a bajillion markers, I wouldn't have had the ability to share that platform with other artists and hopefully help them out and help them find more readers and more fans. And obviously this is another instance where the audio kicked out. Dang these hot Louisiana summer days. But Bo's enjoying his walk, eating loads of grass like a little goat. And I hope you guys are enjoying looking at all of the beautiful flowers and beautiful plants in my mom's lovely flower bed. So since 7-inch Kara was the main comic I was working on, I did have comics and anthologies. I think I've been in about 10 comic anthologies so far. So I do have other comic projects that I've worked on, but since 7-inch Kara was kind of the main body of work I was working on at the time, it's been such a huge influence, the major influence behind all of my Intro to Comic Craft stuff. So in 2016, I started doing more things on YouTube. We'd been sharing the artist interviews since at least 2014, maybe 2013. But I got kind of serious about creating content to share on YouTube around that time. And it was because someone had pointed out to me that if I did video tutorials and video reviews, it would be more accessible to more people, particularly people who might have reading disabilities. And I'm honestly all about accessibility and trying to make art as accessible as possible. Because I really believe that art should be for everyone, and I don't want learning disabilities or financial difficulties to stop people from pursuing their artistic interests. And kind of growing up without having access to those things made it even more important for me to share them. So, like I'd mentioned way earlier on, 7-inch Kara started on the cheapest Canson watercolor paper with student grade, I believe it was Cotman watercolors. And I was really dissatisfied with that first chapter. I was dissatisfied with how muddy everything looked. So I started buying and trying out different watercolor supplies from Blick. And between me and Heidi, we kind of amassed a small collection of watercolor supplies. And at that point, I thought it might be really helpful to share what I learned about making watercolor comics in a more organized way with other artists. So that kind of started the watercolor product reviews. And I have done so many watercolor paint and watercolor paper reviews here on the channel as well as over on the blog. I haven't reviewed quite everything. I'm not Parka Blogs. I do have to buy everything out of my own pocket, which is possible thanks to Patreon, which I really appreciate. But I have reviewed quite a lot, and all of them are in service to watercolor comics because that's where my heart is. So I've also talked quite a bit about like what materials I use specifically for watercolor comics and why I use those materials rather than, say, more professional watercolor paper. So I'm going to link some of those videos as well if you guys are kind of curious about the materials that I use. But I wanted to share that because, again, so many people at cons looking at Kara would be like, I wish I could watercolor, or I tried watercoloring and everything I do turns really muddy, or watercolors just always lift off the paper. And I thought sharing the reviews that sharing the products, whoa! I don't know what that was, but that was a big something that just ran out of the flower bed. It was a mammal. Okay, so both Bowie and my phone decided it was too hot, so I put my phone in the freezer for a little minute just to help it cool down. So let's pick up where we left off. So I was going through half pans of Winsor & Newton professional grade really fast, and I was specifically buying their half pans because I had attended this lecture where the Winsor & Newton reps said that the half pans are specifically formulated, unlike other companies, to reactivate. And then I got tired of paying so much money, and I wanted to find a good alternative for the Kara pages, because when you're painting hundreds of watercolor comic pages and every page has at least 2 panels, often 4 or 6, you go through a lot of paint and it gets really expensive. And since I was doing this without a publisher, I needed to be able to afford it myself. So that spurred so many professional grade watercolor reviews. And it's introduced me to so many paints I really love, and it's allowed me to share this love with you guys, because for me, swatching isn't enough. It doesn't really tell me what I need to know, so I want to do a field test. I really want to put it through its paces and see if it's everything I think it is before I recommend it to somebody. And I break those up into 2 videos because doing the field test separately allows me to treat it as a tutorial, so maybe I can help more people learn how to watercolor. Maybe it makes it more accessible for people. And I usually use Kara as the subject of my field test because this way I'm kind of consistently painting the same character, so it allows me to kind of set a baseline for what I want from my paints, but also it gives me a chance to talk about 7-inch Kara with people who have never heard of it before and maybe gain some new fans or gain some new readers. But I don't regret all those reviews at all, because I've found so many paints I really love that really make painting a joy. And of course, with paints, you got to test out papers. And typically for my field test reviews, I focus more on cotton rag papers than I do on cellulose papers, because frankly, I've already found what I'm looking for in Montval for Kara pages. It's accessible. I can get it almost anywhere. I can order it in the correct size. It runs through my printer. So I focus most of my paper reviews on cotton rag papers. And that's because I love using cotton rags for standalone illustrations. I like hot press, I like cold press, I like rough press, and I've been able to justify purchasing so many of these papers because, I end up using them for 7-inch Kara illustrations as well. And then for the past few years, I've been doing Lilliputian Living during October as my inking assignment, inking challenge, whatever you want to call it. And that's introduced me to so many black and white inking products that I've really enjoyed, and I can. So hopefully you guys can see how much of an influence 7-inch Kara has had on my art and my artistic life, and how much 7-inch Kara has kind of brought into the world and inspired Basically, none of the tutorials I do would exist without my work on 7-inch Kara. None of the panels I've done would exist without my work on 7-inch Kara. Most of the classes I've taught wouldn't exist without my work on 7-inch Kara. So much of what I do here, what I share freely with people, is because of 7-inch Kara. So, now is the time when I ask you guys for your support with that project. Printing volume 2 really means a lot to me, and being able to fund volume 2 via Kickstarter is really important to me because, and maybe this is a mistake on my part, but I feel like this is kind of a chance for people who have enjoyed my work, who've enjoyed my tutorials, who've benefited from my reviews, to help support something I really love and help make it possible. And I have some really fantastic rewards for you guys, from copies of volume 1 and 2 to adorable Kickstarter exclusive wooden charms to custom art, including original watercolors, many of which you guys have seen here as field tests. So if there's one you fell in love with, that could be a reason to back at that tier. So it's at 7inchkara.com/Kickstarter. You guys will be able to find a link down below, along with links to some of my series headings like Intro to Comic Craft and Watercolor Basics, and you'll also be able to find links in the end cap and in the cards, hopefully YouTube permitting, because it's been real weird with me lately. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. I'm always interested in hearing like the outside factors that kind of go into inspiring artists beyond just like, oh no, I just like looking at art, which is true, but we all feel that way. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this vlog, and hopefully I'll see your support on Kickstarter, and I'll see you guys again really soon. Bye guys! So, true to being ADHD myself, I forgot to mention that Kara herself is coded to be ADHD. I'm ADHD, so of course I wrote her to be ADHD, and I wanted it to be a really positive reflection of ADHD. And so much of thinking about that and talking about being ADHD with other artists and finding out they're ADHD, or they go and they get diagnosed and, oh hey, yeah, they're ADHD as well, has inspired the My Life with ADHD series. So, if you are looking for positive ADHD rep, especially to share with a younger person in your life who is ADHD and they might be feeling pretty down about themselves, because that was something I know I struggled with and a lot of you guys struggled with, or even a kid who has a lot of traits in common with Kara but isn't necessarily ADHD, I really think they might enjoy reading 7-inch Kara. So a lot of My Life with ADHD has been inspired by the things I've gone through as an artist who has ADHD, which of course as an artist, my major body of work being Kara ties in with that. But I just totally lost my train of thought, and I've been so ADHD lately here in Louisiana. It's like my brain just turns to complete mush between the heat and all the stuff that's going on, and then COVID stuff too. So I hope you guys will forgive me. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this vlog, and I hope you guys will consider supporting 7-inch Kara Volume 2 on Kickstarter.